Patch 3.25 Settlers of Kalguur is here. I'm going to show you everything you need to know to succeed as an Ice Trap Saboteur. As you can see here, this build is absolutely incredible. So let's start off by looking at the pros and cons and see what the build is actually about. Well, we are going to be, of course, using the Ice Trap gem. That is the main thing that we are actually using here. For most of Path of Exile history, traps have been known as a really strong league starter, and this one is no different. It doesn't require expensive uniques or heavy crafting to kill bosses early on, and this still remains true in Settlers of Kalguur. Often, it can be overlooked, despite the built-in defense layer of the Freeze and Chill. The gear as well is going to be really cheap for this build, and it is a fantastic league starter. We're just going to toss in a couple of salvos near a pack and move on. You can see here the traps have big AoE and they do hit hard really well. And we also don't overlook any defenses like some other trap builds will do. So what are the actual pros and cons then? Well, there's a fantastic power curve, as traps are historically, like I said, a cheap starter with very good early on uniques. And I would say, well, as well as that it is again a big league starter. The acts and also early mapping are very, very easy with this build. You're not going to have to do a lot of work to get into them. When it is then time to actually start upgrading, the next pieces after that are also quite cheap. Now then, let's look at the cons, however, the part I hate the most when doing these build guides. So, it is tankier, like I said earlier, than other trap builds. I'm not going to lie and say that it's the tankiest build on Earth. It's not. The defenses aren't still fully there until you get your Determination gem running. Some people also love or hate this playstyle. It's a bit like Marmite, if you know what that is. If you're from the UK, people in the US might be like, what the hell? Traps are a different feeling from attacking or casting directly, and it is a bit more like playing brands if you've done that before. Whereas it's still quite different from like a totem minion build in the way that they do things for you. You're still, as you can see here, having to kind of put in the workload yourself, God forbid. So how does it actually play then? Well, talking about the Ice Trap gem specifically, like I said, it has a big AoE and you're going to throw it into the center of packs or bosses as well, as you were seeing here. Here we are showing it with the packs. Means then that it is really, really good for mapping. Throw a few traps out, move on. Throw a few traps out, move on. And just rinse and repeat again, as you can see here in the gameplay I'm showing. Anything that doesn't die will be chilled and frozen so that we can quickly finish them off as well. For bosses, we can stack the traps between phases in an intermission, for example, or just during the fight whenever we get a chance to do so. And we can also have over 20 traps out at a time for single target damage. This does sound a lot, however, it's not going to absolutely obliterate your PC and the screen like some builds do, like exploding arrows, etc., that may do that. This build has a lot of them, but it's more reserved. It's fun, but reserved. It's a good midpoint, I think, for how much craziness there is going on the screen. So it's obviously a cold-based spell, and we are going to be wanting to stack a lot of gem levels and spell or cold mods on there. The cast speed can be used later when we get our Slave Driver's Hand. More on that in the gear shortly. Since this is a crit build as well, because we want to do big burst damage, we love that as well. And it can roll really high on a wand and shield. And finally, we want to stack as much damage chance as we can, and we're going to be getting that from our unique jewel called Lethal Pride. And again, more on that in the jewels section of this video. Defensively then, it is again, fairly stacked up, but it's not the best of the best out of all defensive builds. We're going to be running Grace, we're going to be blinding, which basically is reducing your enemy's chance to hit with capped spell suppression. Not only do we blind everything near us, we'll also be taking 15% damage from blinded enemies, so that works in tandem with each other. And then late game, we're going to be putting on our Determination, which is where this build really starts getting tankier. Now moving on to the gear, flasks, and jewels that we are going to be using. By the way, I am going to put an early league and then later league POB link in the description. So what we're going to look at first is basically how we're putting the build together as we go through the early acts and then into early mapping. Then we're going to move on to a more end game build that I can show you and kind of how we're going to transition over from one to the other. So to actually get your, let's go through gems as well. Let's go through gear. In fact, let's go through gems, then we'll go through the gear and flasks, etc. And for early game, and then we'll move on to end game. Thinking out loud. So you're not actually going to be able to get your ice trap until Act 3. So what I would recommend is using explosive trap in Act 1, 2, and then until you get ice trap in Act 3. So this is what we're going to be going for here. So using our explosive trap with swift assembly and then chance to poison. We're going to put, for our movement, a little cheeky flame dash on there. It's one of the first things I love to use in Act 1, just whooshing out with a little flame dash. Vitality, and then clarity. TLDR, if you don't know what these two do, Vitality gives you life regen, and Clarity gives you mana regen. It really is as simple as that. And flame dash, you go whoosh and do a little flame dash. It's a good movement skill, okay? Just trust me on that one. Act 2, you're going to add like skitterbots, cold snap, steel skin, a few little things like that just to bump up your defenses a little bit. And then let's skip right onto Act 3, which is where it starts coming together a bit more with your ice trap. So what do summon skitterbots actually do? Well, these are actually going to detonate and activate your mines. Steel skin is going to absorb some damage for you, making you a bit more hardy. Vitality, flame dash, and cold. Did we go for cold snap? I don't think we actually did. Well, basically what Cold Snap does is it creates a big area AoE damage of cold that expands. And then our concentrated effect we're adding on here in like Swift Assembly, Trap and Mine damage, of course, increasing our damage, adding how many we can get out there and how quickly these are going to come out, having a chance to do extra. So it's pretty simple at this point. The hardest bit is going to be getting something to put on with the links. So, you can want 3 greens and a blue. Shouldn't be too difficult, but, it's always one of the annoying things early on in the acts I find. Apart from that, everything isn't really linked at this point, so it should be really, really easy to get these gems on your gear. So once we then get onto the later acts, basically there's going to be not too many changes, as you can see here, that we're actually adding to our gem priority. Like I said, this is a really good league starter where we can really get going on the build quite early on, and we're not making huge changes to it as we level up. So we're going to be putting on inspiration here. This is going to help with adding some crit chance, adding some mana and elemental damage, and also actually helping with mana costs itself. Charged traps is going to do quite a few things, basically just making our traps a lot more formidable with crit and things like that. Increased critical strikes does what it says on the tin. The only other one, apart from here, we're adding on is Assassin's Mark. So what Assassin's Mark does is it is a curse that you're going to be putting on your enemies, making them a lot more, or a lot less resistant, should I say, to critical strikes from you. And then Steel Skin, summon your Stone Golem, which summons a Stone Golem to help you, and then cast when damage taken, which does what it says on the tin. Again, are basically just some extra defensives that you can get there. Let's now have a look at the gear and also the flasks and jewels that you're going to be putting on in this early game phase. On your helm early on, Heat Shiver is a really good option. You do want to be going for armor or evasion with spell suppression. It's going to be very difficult to hit 100% if you are not getting a lot of your spell suppression here, unless you have the Grace mod on your Watcher's Eye. Another specific unique is going to be the Dark Ray Vectors, Dragon Scale Boots. On here you can see I've got increased armor and evasion. Again, resistances. I always like to hype up resistances. I feel like a lot of new players or people in league starters always overlook resistances. You really need to be capping your resistances and getting them up to 75% at least ASAP. This is really, really important, and you will be dying a lot without these. So always try and get your resistances where possible. As you get into the higher levels, you want to try and then aim for some more chaos resistance over general resistances, but resistances all round is never a bad thing. Movement speed on the boosts, on the boots, not the boosts. Movement speed on the boots is something else that I always heavily recommend where possible, as much as possible here. We can see we're going for 5% increased per frenzy charge, and we're adding 1 maximum frenzy charge on these boots, 40% reduced frenzy charge duration, 25% reduced light radius, and 10% increased evasion rating, again, per frenzy charge. If you are just going for something rare, then generally some stun avoidance would be really good as well. On the rest, at this point, I'm just putting on a lot of yellows, really. There's nothing else too exciting to really note. Any cold damage will be good, crit will be good, etc, etc. And again, getting up those resistances. We're going through the items a bit more in a deeper level when we go on to the more end game unique items that we are getting, because there are going to be a few more in that part. Again, POB is in the description for you after you've watched this video. For your basic jewels, what I'm really aiming towards here, as you can see, I think, yep, I am on the right side of the screen. I had to make sure I wasn't in the corner. Is really just increased trap damage, increased trap damage, increased trap damage. We want as much trap damage as possible for obvious reasons, and this is what I generally go for in the early game with this build, alongside maximum life. On the life flask, I love to always go to immunity to bleeding, of course. More recovery if used when on low life is always a fantastic one as well, and immunity to corrupted blood for 13 seconds if used while affected by corrupted blood. Generally, that's what I'm going to go for on the life flask at this point. I'm going for the Masochist's Granite Flask of the Skank, oh my god! Gain 2 charges when you are hit by an enemy, 42% less duration, and again, immunity to bleeding and corrupted blood during the flask effect. Again, gaining charges when you're hit by an enemy. I always love to gain charges when hit. I think they are fantastic. Masochist's Quicksilver Flask of the Walrus here. Again, gaining charges when hit by an enemy. And immunity to freeze and chill during effect is a fantastic one that we can get on here. Lastly, the Masochist's Quart Flask of Persistence. Gaining 2 charges again while we're being hit. And avoidance on stun. If you don't get that on the boots, it's really good to have it on your flasks. That you've got it from somewhere else is something I really recommend. Okay, now starting to look through at the more end game build that we're going to be trying to work towards. This is what I'm going for here. Some changes in a few slots and some on the gems. We're going to be talking through those now. As you get into end game, Heat Shiver is still going to be appropriate for you, really up through the mid-range, etc. Once you get to the real end game, I would then try and go for something crafted. And I actually haven't put them on here, but the Slave Driver's Hand on your gloves is going to be really impactful as well. So that is the Slave Driver's gloves, Slave Driver's Hand, which is on the glove slot, is what you're putting on there. Other uniques, you've got the Carcass Jack on the chest, increased evasion and enemy shield, maximum life, massive elemental resistances on there, increased area of effect, increased area damage, and extra gore, my favourite. So the massive extra area of effect and damage there is going to massively impact, obviously, the size of the traps that you are laying out, which is really important for this build, as it is, of course, a trap build. On the neck, the Replica's Dragonfang Flight Onyx Amulet is really fantastic. So, again, we've got elemental resistances on here. The main thing is we're doing a +3 to the level of all Ice Trap gems. And of course, it is actually a gem skill spell that we're using here for Ice Trap, so adding an extra 3 levels to our Ice Trap gem is massive for this. This neck is fantastic for this build. It's really obvious why, just with that one line there with the Ice Trap gem levels, it is fantastic. We do get 10 to 15% increased reservation efficiency on all skills as well, which is of course not to be scoffed at, and items and gems have a 10 to 15% reduced attribute requirements as well. On the Scepter here, again, more increased elemental damage, increased spell damage, 75% I've got here, increased critical strike chance for spells, and +1 level to all cold spell skill gems, again, adding levels to that Frost Trap gem. Make sure to have the suffix trigger for free on the craft. As you can see here, to get a socketed spell when you use a skill with an 8-second cooldown, spells triggered this way have 150%. What we can basically do here when socketed into this is we can use our Assassin's Mark curse on use there with that, so that we can just be getting that curse out on our enemies as applicable and not having to really worry about it as much. Apart from that, really, what you're going to see here is a lot of spell damage and critical strike chance and damage, adding any sort of frost damage or pluses to those skills. On my belt here, on the Stygian Vise, you can see I've got 11 to 12% increased trap throwing speed, meaning we can get those traps out even faster as well, which is, of course, one of the main draws to this item from the build. Apart from that, on the Flasks, not really changing anything from what I've spoke about before. It's all pretty damn similar. However, on the jewels, there are a few things we are going to be changing up. Specifically, Watcher's Eye or Lethal Pride on the jewels would be absolutely fantastic. Let's start off with what I've got here, Watcher's Eye. So the goal is to get to Hatred crit percentage and have a really good secondary. If you can't get these, life regen or some resistances to certain things may be fine as well. But Lethal Pride is going to be the one you really want to go for on here. It's going to give double damage and life, and it can run quite expensive. But it does give a lot of strength, meaning it's a lot easier to get those hit requirements. Apart from that, again, on your normal jewels, we're just going for, again, increased trap damage where possible, maybe some strength and life, etc. Maybe some reduced mana cost on skills. Really not that exciting. I, of course, love the 15% increased trap damage, as always. And then on your clusters, I would go with 8 added passives with Prismatic Heart, Blanketed Snow, and Widespread Destruction. This is going to give us really optimal pathing to the nodes that we actually want to get to, including some dual sockets. And then in your medium cluster gems, I would go for these ones here. Again, adding passive skills. Careful Handling and Guerrilla Tactics are going to be the ones that you're trying to go for here. And again, added small passive skills grant 12% increased trap damage. Woohoo for more trap damage, of course. Apart from that, just going quickly back to the gems that we actually have on our gear, nothing much is really changing. Life tap on Assassin's Mark. I like to go with Grace with Enlighten and Bone Chill on your with your Skitterbots. Vitality, Clarity, and Hatred can always quite nice. And I like to stay with Flame Dash, going for Animalonus, Bear Trap, and Inspiration on there. Not really anything else changing, and the build is pretty much together at this point. Now then that we've been through all of that, let's look at the last few things tying this build together, like your Pantheon, Ascendancy, and what to do about those bandits in Act 2. Starting off with the Ascendancy, this is obviously what we're going for. Ta-da! First one I'm going to go for is an Explosives Expert. That's right. So we've got here 40% to critical strike multiplier against burning enemies, 80% increased critical strike against shocked enemies, and damage penetrates 10% of their elemental resistance against chilled enemies. Boom. There we go. That is the resistance we're going to be knocking through for chilled enemies. After that, we're then going to go straight up into Chain Reaction and then down through Pyromaniac. Just to go through the minors as well, I always like to talk about these very briefly. Area of effect and elemental resistance is on here. On area of effect, trap throwing speed. Again, get those traps out faster and more trap area of effect. On to Chain Reaction. This is one of my favourite ones. Skills used by traps have a 50% increased area of effect, massively increasing how big our AoE is on these trap skills that we're using here. Area of effect and more trap throwing speed there, so we can get them out super quick. And then lastly, Pyromaniac. Well, not lastly, we've got one more. You're immune to Ignite and Shock. Woohoo. Regenerate 2% of life per second for each mine detonated recently, and also for each trap detonated recently. And this will be up to 10% per second. There's some fantastic kind of survivability there on the Pyromaniac one. Lastly, then, we're going to come down to Born in the Shadows, area of effect, and this is where the blind effect that I mentioned in the pros and cons comes in. So we've got an 8% increased area of effect and 15% increased blind effect. Then we go into Born in the Shadows, you cannot be blinded whatsoever, and you get a 15% reduced damage taken from blinded enemies. Nearby enemies are also blinded. Don't forget on this one as well, the blind effect is increased by 15%. So we cannot be blinded, and we're going to be blinding nearby enemies, and we're going to take reduced damage from those blinded enemies, which all ties together really, really nicely. For the bandits, because we are needing a lot of passives in this build, we're going to kill them all, and that's that. And then for your Pantheons, on the major, I would go for the Brine King for the stun and freeze immunity. And then Shikari, once powered up, is going to be the minor, which will give you a lot of poison resistance there. And that is pretty much it, guys. That is how you're going to play Ice Trap Saboteur in patch 3.25 Settlers of Kalguur. Hopefully this was really useful to you, and I'd love to hear how you get on with this build. It's an incredibly fun one if you do like trappers, and it makes a great, fantastic league starter because of how quickly you can just get into things with this. Please do subscribe and leave a thumbs up if you did like the video, or leave a thumbs down if you didn't like it. But thanks for watching either way, it is appreciated. If you would like to support the channel, and I am a very small channel, obviously, then please do also consider joining my Patreon. This really, really supports small creators like me who do not make very much money and do have full-time jobs, as well as spending all of my free time making these, which I do enjoy, but, you know, every little helps after all, and the support is really, really appreciated. If you do have any questions on any of my builds and you'd like some one-to-one support, I am really happy to provide that on either Patreon or in the VIP Discord that opens up from Patreon in the Discord, funnily enough. And if you are looking for other builds, I am doing a ton of them. I've been theory crafting for weeks and weeks before this patch going live, and there is a whole playlist here of ones for you to binge and watch if you would like.